This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Hello, I'm Emmy Leese, and welcome to the latest episode of Think Like a Vegan, a companion podcast to our book, also entitled Think Like a Vegan. There's an iconic poster from the anti-Vietnam War protests in the U.S. in the 1960s. The background is yellow with a hand-drawn sunflower and the words, "War is not healthy for children and other living things." Of course, that includes animals, whether they're used in military activities or domestic or wild animals who may be victims. But it's not something we talk about often. And my guests today, Sara van Goozen and Josh Milburn, are the first to include considering harm to animals in just war theory. And broadly speaking, they'll tell us more about it, but just war theory looks at whether a war is justified, and if so, how that war should be conducted. Today, I welcome back to the podcast Josh Milburn, and welcome for the first time Sara van Goozen. Sara is a lecturer at the University of York. Her research focuses on topics in contemporary just war theory and global ethics. She's written about risk distribution in war, the moral status of animals in war, and the distribution of scarce medical resources. Sara is also interested in various other areas in contemporary political theory, such as the literature on political obligation and sovereignty. Josh is a moral and political philosopher interested in questions about human and animal relationships, food, libertarian political theory, and applied ethics. He's a lecturer in political philosophy at Loughborough University and a member of the Research Advisory Committee of the Vegan Society. Josh is also the host of the animal studies podcast, Knowing Animals, which is streaming on all platforms. And his first book, Just Fodder, The Ethics of Feeding Animals, was the subject of an earlier episode of this podcast. Welcome, Sara and Josh.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be here.
Before we hear from you, I want to read a short passage from the paper you co-authored entitled Counting Animals in War, First Steps Towards an Inclusive Just War Theory, which was published in the journal Social Theory and Practice. You write, "Despite the occasional nod towards ecological damage as something that needs to be taken seriously in assessments of the justice of military action, harms to animals go basically unmentioned. For example, a 2018 conference exploring non-human value in war asked how we ought to compare harms to human beings to damage to objects or the environment, how we ought to distribute resources between protecting humans and protecting objects, whether one may intentionally harm humans for the sake of protecting non-human values, how we ought to restore heritage in the aftermath of conflict, and how we ought to compensate for damage to heritage sites." Here, then, we see theorists seeking to explore the impact of war beyond humanity. But these theorists choose to focus on landscapes, artifacts, and the environment, not animals. Similarly, the 28 principles drawn up by the UN's International Law Commission about environmental protection in war do not even include the word animal. Although it shouldn't be, I can't help but see this as a brutally plain reminder of anthropocentrism. With that, Josh and Sara, the floor is yours.
Thanks. And thanks for picking up on that passage, because I think it's absolutely right that this is a clear example of an area where anthropocentrism has really dominated. And that's something that really we want to challenge. So Sara and I are working on a collaborative project which explores the intersections of animal ethics and the ethics of war. And a major starting point for us has to be that war impacts animals in all kinds of ways. Some of these are obvious and some of them are less obvious. So take the ongoing crisis in Ukraine. Listeners may have seen pictures or press reports about companion animals fleeing with human refugees or else being left behind when their guardians are forced from their homes. Listeners may also have seen difficult stories about the impact of the war on animals kept in zoos or farms in Ukraine. And they may have seen the environmental destruction that the war has wrought and wondered about the impact this has on wild animals. Or perhaps they've seen the stories about the animals being used as soldiers in various ways, the dogs and cats being kept by soldiers as mascots perhaps, or the intriguing story of Max, a Russian military dog who reportedly switched sides after being adopted by Ukrainian soldiers. So we became really interested in how we might think through the ethical implications of these animals' entanglements in human conflict. But we very quickly realised that this was a big question, asking us to reassess the foundations of the ethics of war, and maybe even calling for us to rebuild the ethics of war from the ground up. And that's because, as we'll explain shortly, and as you've pointed out, Emmy, the ethics of war has always been resolutely anthropocentric, concerned almost entirely with the impacts of war on humans. We also realised that rethinking the ethics of war with animals in mind opened up many more questions than we first imagined. So initially, we were most interested in the question of how to ethically account for the fact that wars almost inevitably hurt animals, just as they almost inevitably hurt innocent humans, like civilians who are displaced. And that's what we were talking about in the paper you just quoted, Emmy. But we quickly found ourselves confronting very challenging, even disturbing questions about whether, for example, harm to animals could itself ever justify war. For example, could an animal rights respecting state legitimately go to war with another state because the second state refused to respect animal rights? Now, that's, of course, a hypothetical question right now, as there are no animal rights respecting states. But it's a sort of question we found ourselves asking, and we're not sure if we have an answer yet. In short, we found ourselves asking what it would mean to have what we call an inclusive just war theory. That is, a just war theory that includes animals. But before we get to that, it's worth getting clear on what just war theory is.
So, just war theory is a set of ideas for assessing whether wars or particular actions within wars are ethically acceptable. Just war theorists accept that wars, regrettably, are going to happen. But they also accept that in our imperfect world, wars can be more or less just, or at least they can be just in theory. But just war theory isn't just a philosophical idea. It's also been hugely influential in the development of international humanitarian law, for instance, the Geneva Conventions. In brief, according to just war theory, violence is just if it meets certain criteria. Though these criteria have developed over time, there's remarkable agreement on the main points. The key distinction is between jus ad bellum, or just recourse to war, and jus in bello, or justice in war. So a war is just in the ad bellum sense, that is, it's permissible to go to war if 6 criteria are met. First, there must be a just cause, such as self-defense. States can't go to war, for example, for economic reasons or because, politics reasons. Second, states must have the right intention when they go to war. They can't use a just cause as a pretext for a war of conquest. Third, war must be declared by a legitimate authority, like a democratically elected leader. Fourth, the war must have a reasonable chance of success, because otherwise any violence would be pointless. And fifth, the war must be a last resort, which means that states must try peaceful methods first. And finally, the war must be proportionate. Roughly, that means that a war cannot cause more harm than it's seeking to prevent. Any war that doesn't meet all of these requirements is not, strictly speaking, a just war. So it's not ad bellum just if it fails to meet any of these requirements. On the other hand, jus in bello concerns the behavior of combatants in war. This list is slightly more simple. There's 3 requirements. First, discrimination, or the requirement of discrimination, requires that combatants differentiate between legitimate and illegitimate targets. Legitimate targets are military targets. illegitimate targets are any non-military targets. So in other words, combatants may never target non-combatants or non-combatant property, and they may only legitimately target military individuals or property. Second, proportionality, again, roughly means that the harm caused by any given action in war shouldn't be greater than the harm it's seeking to prevent. And third, necessity, or the necessity requirement, requires that any action or mission in war causes only necessary harm. So soldiers should try to pursue less harmful courses of action if they have a choice.
But just war theory, traditionally, as we've said, has been highly anthropocentric. And what this means is that the harm that it measures and that it aims to prevent is harm to humans. So, for example, a war will be considered disproportionate, or an action in war will be considered disproportionate if it involves very large amounts of harm to humans. But it probably won't be if it involves very large amounts of harm to animals. Or consider another example. While animals will probably be considered illegitimate targets, that is, it would be indiscriminate to shoot them, this is because of their value to humans. This means, for example, that farmed animals receive some protection in international humanitarian law, at least according to some lawyers, but that's because humans want to eat them, not because they are considerable or valuable for their own sake. Now, admittedly, there have been a few academics who have tried to tie together animal ethics and just war theory before we started to ask the question, but their efforts have been very piecemeal. What academics haven't done is try to systematically include animals in just war theory, and thus what they haven't done is develop what we call an inclusive just war theory. Now, we think that this is regrettable, and so we've tried to take the first steps towards developing that theory. An inclusive just war theory would answer or provide tools to answer lots of pressing questions about animals and war. It'd tell us, for example, when harm to animals constitutes a just cause for war, and more broadly, how to include animals in considerations of jus ad bellum. It'd also tell us whether the eradication of animals could itself be a just cause, and if that idea even makes sense. It'd tell us how to factor animals into questions of fighting justly, and thus how to include animals' interests in calculations of proportionality and necessity. And it'd also tell us under what circumstances animals might be legitimate military targets, and thus whether the targeting of animals could ever be discriminate. And it'd also tell us when, if at all, it's appropriate to use animals on the battlefield, and that's something we'll come back to a little bit later. Now, to answer these questions, an inclusive just war theory must also address some very foundational questions in animal ethics. For example, it needs to offer a clear assessment of the value of animals and the weight that commanders must therefore afford to animal interests in their decision-making. And this includes questions about animal relationships. For example, we can ask a very complicated question, but a very pressing question, about whether commanders should afford greater weight to the interests of their animals over the interests of enemy or neutral animals. And again, we can also ask whether these ideas of enemy and neutral animals even make sense. And of course, an inclusive just war theory needs to offer a very clear account of which interests animals have and how strong those interests are. And again, that's something that we're going to come back to in a second. So I hope it's clear from all this why this is a major project for us and why developing an inclusive just war theory is far from a straightforward exercise. But I think it's also really important to clarify what we're not doing. In proposing an inclusive just war theory, we're not saying that just war theory can solve all of the challenges that we face when it comes to human-animal relationships. So, for example, the political theorist Dinesh Wadiwell very famously argues that we are at war with animals, and so that all of our interactions with animals are like those in war. Now, we don't necessarily think that. We're open to it and we explore that idea and we engage with Wadiwell's work. But instead, we think that an inclusive just war theory is going to be very helpful for solving very particular puzzles about human-animal relationships. And in particular, it's going to be useful for solving those questions about relationships that occur in warfare. The harm to animals is caused by human warfare.
We'll stop here for a musical interlude and return with more from Josh and Sarah. This is more music from my featured musician this season, Matthew Gerstenberger, and you can hear more about him in episode 1 of this season. This is Over the Pacific at 3:30 a.m. too. We're back for the second part of Josh Milburn's and Sara van Goozen's discussion on including animals in just war theory.
Let's consider an example of the sort of puzzle that we're interested in. In our 2021 paper, Counting Animals in War, which you quoted from earlier, we made the case for including animals in proportionality and necessity calculations, so a relatively small scope argument, really. We argued that harm to animals should be included in the calculations that politicians and military commanders make when weighing up how harmful particular courses of action are going to be, both when determining the ad bellum justice of the war or ad bellum proportionality and the in bello proportionality and necessity. We argued that animal interest should be considered equally to human interest. That may sound straightforward, but it's actually quite complicated, as these things usually are. This does not mean that humans and animals must be treated the same at all times. Humans and animals may have very different interests, and this may justify differences in treatment. But we don't think that we should discount interests belonging to animals simply because they belong to animals. We recognize, for example, that while many humans tend to have a range of sophisticated plans for their future lives, achievements in their careers, families, hobbies, etc., animals' plans for their future tend to be more basic. Obvious examples excluded. I'll repeat that. Obvious examples excluded. obvious exceptions excluded. So humans usually lose much more in dying than animals do. This means that a human's interest in continued life should normally outweigh an animal's interest in continued life. Therefore, it may be proportionate to kill some animals in a combat situation if doing so is the only way to save a human life. But it's going to depend on the animals, of course. Not because the lives of the animals count for less, but because dying is worse for the human than it is for the animal. But we aren't as sure, for instance, that animals have a lower interest in avoiding suffering than do humans. Suffering is very bad for both humans and animals in a way that does not seem to depend on the complexity of your plans for the future, right? So, counting animals in war does not mean the end of war, but it does call for some changes in how militaries engage in war. For example, off the back of this point I made earlier, counting animals in war may require us to think the people involved in decisions about military activities and perhaps the expertise that military commanders are expected to have. International humanitarian law already demands that soldiers take reasonable steps to limit the collateral damage, the foreseeable harm to enemy civilians, perhaps by deploying specialist technology or by consulting experts to determine if the actions will impact civilians. So they will hire lawyers and experts in particular terrains and areas in order to make these kinds of assessments. Now, something similar could be true when it comes to wild animals caught up in warfare. Counting animals in war may require that ethologists, ecologists, and other specialists in, for instance, animal behavior or animal psychology are consulted prior to acting. It may also mean that such specialists are present full-time or that military personnel receive training in this area. It may even require that military R&D involves zoological research. This may sound like a big ask, and in many ways it is, of course. But we note that militaries already engage in this kind of work to limit their impact on some animals. But their concerns are usually very selective and focused on charismatic animals or particularly endangered animals. For example, many navies have developed principles and protocols and engaged closely with experts in doing so to limit the impact of sonar on whales and dolphins. And this is something that we can build on then, right? So we think that these steps, though far from straightforward, are realistic ways that militaries could limit the incidental harm that they inflict on wild animals and in the course of engaging in war.
So let's close by thinking about a question that so far hasn't received any attention from just war theorists, but one that we think is absolutely central to the question of an inclusive just war theory. Is it permissible to use animal soldiers? Now, let's be clear that animals are used on the battlefield in all kinds of ways. They're used as guards, as transport, as mascots, to search for enemies or allies or traps, and even in combat roles. And so we should be very careful not to run these together. And when we are ethically appraising the use of animals in military roles, we need to be clear on what particular use we're talking about. Now, although these questions haven't received attention from just war theorists, there are a number of existing frameworks in the scholarly literature that may be very helpful in thinking through the questions. And this is an example of the sort of work that Sara and I would be very interested in conducting in the future. So first, and I think this might be quite popular with some listeners, we could take an abolitionist or a pacifist line on animal soldiers. This would say that the use of animal soldiers of all kinds is completely illegitimate and must end. Now, that certainly gives us an answer to the question of whether we can use the animal soldiers, but it doesn't help us much with the related question or the related sets of questions about how to treat those animal soldiers who, like it or not, do appear on battlefields at present. Second, we could look to existing conversations in just war theory about what philosophers call innocent threats. Now, innocent threats are individuals who are not acting wrongfully, but who nonetheless present a real and present danger. So a clear example of an innocent threat would be a child soldier. Children cannot be held responsible for the fact that they're being sent to war, but if there is someone with a gun in front of you, they are presenting a real danger to you. Now, comparing animal soldiers to child soldiers and other examples of innocent threats does get us some clear answers about how to treat animal soldiers on the battlefield, but it's less able to tell us whether we may permissibly use animal soldiers. So in some ways, it's a reverse of the opposite. I'll say that again. So in some ways, it's a reverse of the previous framework. It can answer one question, but not the other. A third approach we could take is that we could look to international humanitarian law, which we've already mentioned a couple of times. So scholars in this literature, lawyers and legal professors and jurists, are in many ways ahead of the game compared to just war theorists, as there's been quite a lot of sophisticated and very useful work exploring where animal soldiers fit into existing international law. Now, we find this work extremely valuable, and it's naturally... Say that again. Now, we find this work extremely valuable, but one of its limitations is that it's naturally tied to existing law and existing legal frameworks, so it's perhaps a little less exploratory than philosophers like Sara and I can be. Simply put, Sara and I don't want to limit ourselves to explorations of what the law is or easy ways that the law could change. We want to think quite openly about what kinds of laws and norms we'd like to aim for. So this leads to a fourth approach that we could take to the question of animal soldiers. And this draws from what's been called social membership models of animal ethics and animal politics. And what these social membership models do is they look to the kinds of groups that animals belong to and explore extending rights that belong to members of that group to animals. So let me give an example. If some animals are members of our families, maybe they should get the protection of family members in ethical, legal, moral, political terms. And there's already been some very important developments in this area when it comes to, say, custody cases. So certain courts have come to recognise companion animals as more than property and as something like family. So what kind of membership groups might be important for animal soldiers? Because it's probably not going to be family members. Let me point to 3. And just to remind you, what I'm doing here is I'm exploring the sorts of approaches that we could take in exploring the question of animal soldiers, and not necessarily coming to a conclusion about how best to think about animal soldiers, which is something Sara and I hope to be able to do in the future. Now, the first of these membership groups is, of course, soldiers, because existing law, existing morality allows soldiers to receive certain special protections and certain special rights. And this is something that scholars in international humanitarian law have explored, whether animal soldiers could get these same protections, these same legal recognitions. Now, a second approach that we could take is to think about animal soldiers of various kinds as workers. Now, lots of animal ethicists have recently argued that animals should receive something like workers' rights. But when we apply this to the case of animal soldiers, it gets quite tricky, because workers' rights are presumably going to include things like a right to a safe working environment. And a battlefield is surely not going to be a safe working environment. So thinking about animal soldiers as workers might seriously restrict the kinds of military uses to which we can legitimately put animals. Now, of course, that might not be a bad thing, but it's certainly a consequence of thinking about it in these terms. And let me just offer a third category, which I'm very interested in. And that's particularly noteworthy in a recent development in literature in politics and political theory. And that's the idea that animals might be citizens. So some listeners might have heard of Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicker's book, Zoopolis. Now, Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicker are famous for arguing that some animals are entitled not just to basic rights as animals, but citizenship rights as members of our communities. But that opens up a really interesting possibility when we put it in conjunction with questions about warfare. And Donaldson and Kimlicker haven't yet done that. As the philosopher Matthew McLennan writes in a really intriguing paper, that opens up the question of whether the idea of animal citizenship implies the permissibility of animal citizens, quote, being sent to war, or even a duty on their part to serve in their nation's military interests. If animals are citizens, in other words, maybe we are allowed to use them as soldiers, maybe they even have a duty to act as soldiers in certain cases. And we think that that's a really intriguing cross-section, a really intriguing cross-contamination between animal ethics and the ethics of war.
So what does this all mean? As we suggested, the dominant approach to the ethics of war remains anthropocentric, even while there seems to be an increasing awareness of the impact of war on the animal in all kinds of other areas. As we noted, there's even been an increased interest in this topic in related academic fields, such as international law. What we're trying to imagine is what a less anthropocentric approach to just war theory would look like. It will not end wars or animal suffering in war, just as just war theory doesn't end human suffering in war. But taking a more humane approach to war may make war a little less horrible for animals and humans alike.
Thank you so much, Josh and Sara. This was mind-blowing, and it's very challenging as well, because again, it challenges some inherent biases or inherent, like, well, war never, that sort of thing. And it's also incredibly relevant and poignant in some ways, thinking back to 20 years ago when at the start of the Iraq War, and where we are now, and where everything that we have seen since, and also obviously with Ukraine. So there's a lot of value in thinking about war, even if one is morally opposed to it from an ideological point of view. But I think it's incredibly important and very important to think about it, because it challenges a lot of different perspectives, particularly our relationships with animals and so forth. And so I love that. I love that you talked about the groups and the different entanglements and the cross-contamination. I loved that word that you used there. That was just great. What has been, how has your work been received? I'm curious about that. Whether, and you can just briefly mention it. I'm just curious as to both from an academic standpoint, where there's more interest in it, but also just from regular folks, if you've had a chance to explore it in that way. I'm curious about that.
I think one of the interesting reception points that we've had is sometimes reviewers of our work, and the way academic publishing works is that you send out your paper and people look at it and they don't know who you are and you don't know who they are, but they're experts, you're experts, and you're trying to review each other's work. What sometimes has happened with reviewers is they've been very skeptical about the idea that just war theory can apply to animals, and even in some cases been very skeptical about the idea that war is impactful on animals. So actually, we've had to, in some ways, step back a little bit and justify what we took to be very obvious, which is that war is very, very bad for animals. And we opened our first paper, Counting Animals in War, with a line that was inspired by one of these reviewers, which was, although we no longer ride into war on horseback, war is still very bad for animals. Because I think war is now perhaps worse for animals than it ever has been, even though in many ways animals are much less visible in contemporary warfare than they have been in historical warfare.
Yeah, I think in terms of interest from non-academic audiences, So I've experienced quite a lot of interest when I mention that I'm interested in this, for instance, from students or other, younger people at university that I work at. I think people are really interested in the idea. I think people still kind of struggle with some of the basic. I mean, as you noted, right, like the way in which thinking about just war theory challenges some of our assumptions. The role that just war theory plays in thinking about the ethics of war in general is something that people struggle with, which is not necessarily an issue here. And I think in a lot of ways, talking about the impact of war on animals, because they're perceived as like true innocents and like pure innocent victims of conflict, is a very good way into thinking about a lot of the issues that people might struggle with if we ask them to think about, I don't know, Russian soldiers.
I think it's also worth stressing, and you're quite right, that we might want to approach war from a kind of anti-war perspective. It's worth stressing that just war theorists like Sara and I, we're not warmongers, right? Of course, we recognise that in a perfect world there would be no war. It's just that we recognise that in the imperfect world in which we live, number one, wars do happen. So better that they happen in more humane ways than less humane ways. And number two, in the imperfect world in which we live, sometimes war is justified. And, the kind of examples we're thinking of might be very obvious, but if a large belligerent state invades a smaller state, not naming any names, the people in that smaller state are allowed to pick up arms and defend their home and defend their families, defend their animals even, And so this is something that, even if we don't want war, and even if, of course, we recognise that war is hell and war is awful and we should be doing everything we can to avoid war, sometimes war is unavoidable.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think what you're doing is really amazing and really terrific, and I really appreciate you both coming here today. So thank you again. But before we go, where can people follow your work, online or otherwise? And do you have any projects you'd like to promote?
I'm relatively difficult to find online. I don't have a website, but you can find me on Twitter. I am at Dr_SVG. I'm also the editor and regular contributor to a very cool cooperative political philosophy blog called Justice Everywhere, which you can find at justice-everywhere.org. And there I write about war ethics, as well as about pedagogy and the practice of teaching.
You can find links to all of my work on my website, which is josh-milburn.com. And you can also follow me on social media. I'm on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn and on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. But I also encourage everyone to check out my podcast, Knowing Animals, which features interviews with academics in the broad discipline known as animal studies. And of course, given my own interest in war, we do feature quite a lot of conversations about warfare and animals in warfare and the impact of warfare on animals. And you can find Knowing Animals in all the usual podcast places, Spotify, iTunes, etc. And it's also on Twitter and Facebook. So do follow it there.
Fantastic. Thanks again. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Whether during peacetime or in times of war, we manage to exclude animals from all conversations, unless it's when we want to take something from them, be it their bodies, secretions, skins, strength, or lives. We hide behind speciesism to absolve us from even having to think about the moral worth of anyone other than people. And it happens so easily. And before I was vegan, I was guilty of that too. Many years ago, I went to an Animals in War exhibition at the Imperial War Museum in London. The exhibition was all about the animals who had so-called served their country and were labeled heroes. This went from horses to pigeons, rats, dogs, dolphins, cats, and there were even bears and a few mascot pigs. You won't be surprised. The exhibition moved me to tears. I wept openly because it was so evident the animals had no say in their so-called heroics. They'd given no consent to be press-ganged into a military unit and couldn't possibly fathom what they were being asked to do or even understand the terrifying world exploding around them. But you know what? I didn't even think about the billions of animals who were born and killed to feed all those people, either then or now. And I went on being non-vegan. I only related to that exhibit from my perspective, centering my sadness in a narrow historical context of using animals in war, without for a second panning out to think about all the other animals. I took comfort in my moral sensitivity to those so-called heroes, and I just simply ignored the rest. Only when I got out of my own way and I looked critically at my own behavior did I understand there's no good reason to exclude animals from our moral community. There are always going to be tough situations, some of which won't be resolved easily. And so what? Doing what we can to create a more just world is worth it. And I have a recommendation for you. And this isn't a vegan thing either. War is a powerful conduit for learning about a variety of topics, whether history or politics, obviously, but culture, art, and philosophy too. And beyond that, it's a lens through which we can view and begin to understand the deep cultural and societal shifts. If this kind of thing sounds interesting, then I highly recommend the podcast Radio War Nerd, which you'll find on Patreon. I've been a long-time listener, and it's been absolutely illuminating. Next time, we have all these vegan products on supermarket shelves. Does that mean we're winning?
We burn things up when we go around. We speed things up when we go around.
That's it from me, Emmy Leese. Thank you for listening. I'll post a transcript in due course on our website, thinklikeavegan.com. Remember, you can get in touch by email at thinklikeaveganbook@gmail.com or find Think Like a Vegan on social media. You can find me, more of my work and my upcoming events at emmysgoodeating.com and on social media. Subscribe to this podcast, share it with others, and leave us a review. And you can buy Think Like a Vegan anywhere you buy books and audiobooks or request it from your local library. Production credit goes to Jim Moore of Bloody Vegans Productions. Theme music provided by Jenny Moore's Mystic Business from the eponymous album. The opening tune is Flashback, and we close with Tear Things Up. The interval music is by Matthew Gerstenberger, aka Seismicity, on SoundCloud.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.